All right, today we're diving deep into the very heart of financial fragility. We're going to explore how the internal machinery of finance can take a tiny, almost insignificant event and just blow it up into a massive, full-blown crisis. So that brings us to the big question, right? Why is it that sometimes a little hiccup in the market can trigger this catastrophic financial meltdown? It's a puzzle, really, and figuring it out has totally changed how we think about financial risk.
And the answer, it really boils down to one incredibly powerful concept: leverage. Just think of it like a financial amplifier. It's a tool that can absolutely make fortunes, but wow, as we're about to see, it is a seriously double-edged sword.
And here's the fundamental deal with leverage. When everything's going great, it juices your returns, makes you look like a genius. But when the tide turns, that exact same leverage amplifies your losses with just devastating speed. This dual nature, that's the whole key.
Okay, so to really see how this works, let's start with the basic mechanics. We're going to look at a single institution's balance sheet. This is kind of the first layer of amplification.
So here we go, a classic leveraged institution. You see, it controls 100 in assets, but only 10 of that is its own money, its equity. The other 90, that's all debt. You can see right away that the equity cushion is super thin. It's just 10% of the total assets.
Okay, now watch what happens. This is where the brutal math of leverage really kicks in. A small shock hits, and the assets lose just 5% of their value. They drop from 100 to 95. But look what happens to the equity. The debt is still fixed at 90, so that entire 5-point loss gets eaten by that tiny equity cushion. It gets sliced in half, from 10 down to 5. Let that sink in. A tiny 5% drop in assets triggered a massive 50% wipeout of equity. That, right there, is mechanical amplification.
But it doesn't stop there. Not even close. That mechanical effect we just saw, it triggers a predictable and way more dangerous behavioral response. This isn't just about one firm's math anymore. This is about a full-blown chain reaction.
And this is what the source material calls the leverage cycle. It kicks off with that initial shock that just crushed the equity. So what do the firms do? Well, they try to fix their balance sheets, right? They try to deleverage. And how do you do that? You sell assets. The problem is, when everyone tries to sell the same assets at the same time, you get a fire sale. All that collective selling crashes prices, which then damages everyone's balance sheets even more, forcing, you guessed it, another round of selling. It just becomes this vicious, self-reinforcing feedback loop.
And this gets to a really crucial paradox. For any single firm, selling assets to cut your leverage is the smart, rational thing to do. But when everybody does it at once, all those perfectly rational decisions add up to a system-wide, totally destabilizing crisis.
So now let's scale this whole thing up. This isn't just a quirky behavioral thing. It's actually a structural feature of the entire financial system. These feedback loops are literally baked into the architecture, and they connect everybody to everybody else.
And here are the key ways it happens. You've got liquidity spirals, where funding dries up, which forces asset sales, which then crashes market prices. You have procyclicality, which basically means the system just naturally overheats in the good times and then accelerates the crash in the bad times. Balance sheets themselves become channels, transmitting stress directly from one firm to the next. And finally, when credit gets tight, those funding constraints, it just acts like a vice, squeezing firms and forcing even more of those fire sales.
And this quote just brilliantly nails a central paradox of modern finance. The seeds of a crisis are actually planted when everything looks totally calm and stable. I mean, think about the years before 2008. Asset prices were rising, volatility was low, and that encouraged everyone to pile on more and more leverage. So the system becomes the most fragile precisely when it feels the safest. Stability literally breeds instability.
So all of this leads to a really fundamental shift in how we have to think about financial risk. The old models, they just don't work. They don't capture this reality. We need a completely new way of looking at it.
And this slide just lays it out so clearly. The old view was that risk is exogenous, some external shock, like a meteor hitting an otherwise stable system. Crises were just seen as accidents. But the new view is that risk is endogenous. It grows from within the system itself. The system's own structure, its addiction to leverage, is what generates its own instability. Fragility isn't some accident, it's structural.
And that, right there, is the absolute key takeaway. The biggest danger isn't necessarily the size of that first shock. It's the system's capacity for endogenous amplification, its built-in ability to turn a little shock into a catastrophic, self-perpetuating crisis, all through those feedback loops we've been talking about. Which leaves us with the deepest and maybe toughest question of all. If our financial architecture is basically designed to create its own fragility, how on earth do we manage that risk collectively? How do we build a system that can be both efficient and stable? That really is the challenge that defines modern finance.